All right, well, welcome to this America's Public Forum event. Tonight, we'll be talking about reforms to foster bipartisanship and civility in Congress. I'm Keith Allred, the Executive Director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. In a moment, I'll introduce our guests, Congressman Derek Kilmer and Congressman William Timmons. But first, let's cover some logistics. We always have some logistics to make these Zoom events run smoothly, so a few of those points. You'll notice several folks with the ZEM in front of their name. That's Luke Nathan Phillips, Dennis Smith, and Elizabeth Dole. They are the Zoom event managers and are on hand to help you with any tech troubleshooting questions you might have during the meeting. So just feel free to chat any tech related questions to them and they will help you out. We ask you to keep yourself on mute until we get to the audience question and answer section of the program. Throughout the event, though, as you have questions, feel free to chat them to the Zoom event managers, and they're going to help us sort them out. So when we get to the question and answer section, then please use the Zoom raise your hand function, and I'll call on you, and you'll be invited to unmute yourself and ask a question of our speakers. If you chat your question to the Zoom event managers, that's going to make it more likely that we can get to you in the question and answer period. Good. Well, it's now my real pleasure to welcome our guests. We are pleased to have with us tonight first Representative Derek Kilmer, who serves Washington's 6th Congressional District, which is in the Puget Sound area. He is also the chair of the Select Committee on Modernization of Congress. Representative Kilmer is the son of two teachers who taught him the value of education. And wanting to make a difference in his community, he chose to study public policy. He received a BA from Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. He also earned a doctorate from the University of Oxford in England. After finishing his education, Congressman Kilmer worked first as a consultant of McKinsey at McKinsey & Company, and he was helping businesses in the state of Washington and nonprofits and government agencies to run more efficiently. He then worked for the Economic Development Board of Tacoma-Pierce County, where he focused on retaining jobs and attracting new employers. He was first elected to Congress in 2012 after serving 8 years in the Washington State Legislature. While serving in Congress, Chair Kilmer has focused on finding practical common sense solutions. In addition to chairing the Select Committee on Modernization of Congress, he's a member of the Bipartisan Working Group, which we really regard as an important congressional caucus, working to bring Democrats and Republicans together to forge greater consensus on the pressing issues of our day. Derek and his wife Jennifer live in Gig Harbor with their 2 children and their Australian Shepherd Truman. Congressman Kilmer, welcome.
Thanks so much. I need to update my bio because now I have 2 Australian Shepherds.
2 Australian, and what's the name of the second one?
We call her Penny. It's short for Pennsylvania.
I was thinking you needed to play off Truman, and given your bipartisan reputation, you needed a Republican president, maybe. Good. Well, it's very good to have you here, Congressman Kilmer.
Thank you.
We're also pleased to have with us Representative William Timmons, who serves South Carolina's 4th Congressional District, which is the upstate South Carolina. I was learning from Congressman Timmons how to say that, and that includes the Greenville area. And he is also the vice chair of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Representative Timmons began his career as a prosecutor in the Greenville Circuit Solicitor's Office, where he focused on serving victims of domestic violence and helped create one central court for all domestic violence cases in the county. As a businessman in Greenville, Congressman Timmons formed unique coalitions of business leaders to combat the growing costs of burdensome government regulations and taxes. This collaborative effort inspired him to run for the South Carolina Senate, where he served from 2016 until he was elected to Congress 2 years later in 2018. While serving in Congress, Representative Timmons has also had a reputation of working across party lines to make the Congress more accountable to the people. Representative Timmons is a lifelong and active member of Christ Church in Greenville. In addition to serving in Congress, he is a first lieutenant in the South Carolina Air National Guard. Sorry, just a second. Just had a few issues here going with my.
You're fine. Hey, thank you so much for having us. I'm really looking forward to the conversation this evening.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, being with us, Congressman Timmons. And I'll just mention that he lives with his wife, Sarah, in Greenville, and also has an impressive list of degrees studying law and international studies at University of South Carolina and international affairs and political science at George Washington. So great to have you both with us. And I want to just check in here for a second. We were maybe going to have Congressman.
He's here.
Mike Moore, is he here? Congressman Moore is with us, and Congressman Moore has the distinction, I guess we can call it that, of being friends with both Congressman Kilmer and Timmons, and with me. Of course, Congressman Moore serves with them in the Congress, and Congressman Moore and I go way back as friends and as colleagues. And I'll say this, Congressman Moore was one of the first people to join CommonSense American and NICD program we're going to talk about tonight. He joined even before he was elected to Congress. He represents the 1st Congressional District in Utah. Congressman Moore, welcome. Thanks for popping in with us.
Hey, thank you. I know you wanted me to sing the praises of both Representatives Timmons and Kilmer. They're average. They're mediocre politicians. What I would like to highlight today was Mr. Allred. And you will be embarrassed for me to say that, so you can cut me off at any time. I believe in what Keith has been trying to do. We sat in our back patio several years ago when he walked me through the pilot program of what took place in Idaho. There's real data, there's real success there. This can be a broad perspective. He's someone that understands the issues. He's an incredible source to view all this. And I was thrilled to be able to be a piece of commonality between Keith and Reps Timmons and Kilmer. I serve on the bipartisan working group with Kilmer, and Timmons is just one of my fast friends that I made by joining Congress. It's Greenville. They're very, very particular about how they say that in the upstate, how you say Greenville, but it's Timmons, and becoming really close friends with him, just been a mentor and someone that I know is serious about improving the way that we work in Congress. There's a lot of people that are interested, and I'm thrilled that this group was able to get together. I am at my son's baseball game where I just left Hill Air Force Base, and some stuff today. I will tail off a little early and get to that game. But I'm thrilled to be a part of this. So thanks for everybody's work on this.
Thank you, Congressman Moore. Thanks for joining us. So let me give you an overview of where we're going to go from here. So we're going to take a few minutes. I'll ask Congressman Kilmer and Timmons some questions and have them talk with us about their work on the Select Committee for Modernization of the Congress. And then I'm going to share the results from more than 1,200 Americans who reviewed the work of the Select Committee and weighed in on what they thought of their recommendations. So I'm going to share those results, and we'll also hear from a few of those individuals. That's the members of the CommonSense American program that we have at NICD. Then we're going to invite Congressman Kilmer and Timmons to comment and respond on those results, and we'll conclude with your questions for our guests. So we'll proceed to the discussion of the work of the Select Committee of Modernization of the Congress. And so I guess we'll start out, Congressman Kilmer and Timmons, with kind of what the purpose of the Select Committee is, why the Congress formed that. Chair Kilmer, maybe we'll go to you first on that.
Yeah, and again, thanks for having me. About every 20 or 30 years or so, Congress realizes things aren't working exactly as they ought to. And they set up a committee to do something about it. Our committee is the latest iteration of that. The last one was in the early 90s, and then before that in the 70s. Broadly speaking, our mandate is to make Congress work better for the American people. In the rule that established us, and there was a fair amount of discussion leading into the last Congress about rules changes, what rules could be changed to have Congress function better. And as those bipartisan conversations took place, there was a recognition that some of what's broken in Congress is related to rules and procedures, but not all of it. There are other issues, including the degree to which Congress struggles to recruit and retain and have diverse staff. There are issues regarding the use of technology. Congress has been described as a 18th century institution using 20th century technology to solve 21st century problems. I think that's a largely apt description. There's issues around things like constituent communications and the like. And so those were all topics that we were assigned to look at. We've also looked at some issues that don't fit neatly into our mandate, but we think are important, things like the continuity of government, and something I know you are focused on, things like civility and collaboration. So this is the second Congress in which our Congress, so their third year of existence. Initially, the committee was set up to just be a one-year affair. And I think the recognition of those who are interested in reform and of our colleagues was there's a lot of fruit on the vine here that needs picking. And so we were extended now twice to continue this work with an eye towards making Congress work better. At the end of the last Congress, our committee passed 97 recommendations toward that end. We are, a third of them have either been implemented or are in some state of being implemented. And we're working to ensure that all of them are implemented. Our goal is not just to make recommendations that go and get put on a shelf, but to make change so that Congress can work better.
Good, thank you, Congressman Kilmer. Maybe Congressman Timmons, to you, as Congressman Kilmer indicated, the Select Committee's paid a fair amount of attention to reforms that could foster bipartisanship and civility in the Congress. It seems like it's been a point of real emphasis. So first, is that accurate to say that it's been a priority topic for the Select Committee? And then if you could maybe speak a little bit to, why it's gotten the attention it has on the Select Committee.
Sure. I mean, one of the biggest problems facing our country is a general lack of dialogue surrounding the biggest challenges facing our country. So we need to have policy-based conversations on what direction we want to take as a country. And right now, we're not doing that. We're just yelling at each other on Twitter. And I can promise you, we're not going to solve immigration or healthcare or the deficit on Twitter. It's just not possible. So the question is, how do we get people to come together to have real conversations where you actually have to defend your ideas? And that's the biggest thing. I was in the state Senate for 2 years, and I just miss it dearly because we were all sitting in the same room, and you were, literally locked down. You had to be in the room, and someone would take the well and they would advocate for something. And the people in your party would look at you if you said something ridiculous, and they would be like, "Oh, did you just say that?" And then the other party would ask you questions, and you'd have to defend your ideas. We don't have that in Congress, and there's a perverse incentive to be outrageous because the social media and the news cycle and fundraising all creates this challenge. And we are running out of time as a country to really address some of the challenges that we're facing. So I think that this committee, and I was so pleased that it was created and that I was appointed to it. I always say my campaign slogan was Washington is broken. And to be put on the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress as a freshman, and then to get to be the Republican lead, the vice chair as a sophomore, it's everything about why I ran for Congress. So we're going to do everything we can to get people to have real conversations, to build consensus on how we're going to move forward as a country. And this is probably the most important work I've ever done in my life. And it is just very exciting. And I'm very, very, very much looking forward to the rest of this Congress. And again, thank you for having us on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So maybe to both of you, do you want to select, you can kind of count them in different ways. By NICD's count, there are at least 13 different recommendations out of the 97 that we think are, promising for fostering a greater degree of bipartisanship and civility in the Congress. Each want to share one or two of your favorites along those lines that you think could really help kind of create the kind of dynamic that it seems that you've been able to have on the committee?
I'll start maybe, and I'm sure William has some thoughts on this too. Congress is the first organization that I've been a part of that doesn't have a defined and agreed upon goal of what we want to get done. There's no sort of universal mission, and as a consequence, Congress is to some degree 435 independent contractors, all of whom loosely affiliate with one of two general contractors. But it is very much, you know, I think I live in Gig Harbor, Washington, which is the maritime city. I think about it. I use a lot of maritime analogies as a consequence, but you know, the seas are really rocky and it's hard to get the boat where you want to go if everyone's rowing in the same direction. But we got half the people in the boat rowing in one direction, half rowing in the other direction. And no, by the way, about 10% of the people in the boat have their oars out of the water, just actively trying to beat the other folks over the heads. And so one of our recommendations was to do some bipartisan strategy, to actually do bipartisan retreats, both as an institution and within our committees. And our committee does that. We just had our second bipartisan retreat at the beginning of this year, where we all sort of actually talked about what do we want to get done. And those can be hard conversations. I'm not suggesting that the Judiciary Committee will all sing hands, hold hands around the table and sing Kumbaya, or, you know, close each other's eyes and do trust falls into each other's arms, at least not successfully. But I think that there is value in at least having those conversations so that people are bought in and at least have a sense of where the institution is going or where the leaders of the institution want it to go. I think that's a really important recommendation, and one that I hope we can implement.
Yeah, excellent. Congressman Timmons.
Sure. So I always tie things back to my time in the state Senate because that's what I came from. That's what I know. But there were 46 of us, and we all were on a first name basis. We all were kind to each other. We all knew each other. We all knew where each other were from. And being in Congress, there's 435 members in the House, and it's very challenging to even know who everyone is, no less build a relationship. So the biggest problem I see, it all began in the 90s when it became inappropriate to live in Washington. And so when you spend so little time in DC, and I spent literally, did I think about this? As a freshman, I got an apartment because I thought I needed to get an apartment, and it was $2,950 a month. Don't get me wrong, I could have spent a little bit less, but that's how much it is in Washington. It's extremely expensive. And so, you know, in 2019, I spent the night in that apartment 59 nights. 59 nights. So I spend much of my time on the calendar and on the schedule and on trying to find ways to bring people together. You know, we got a weekend coming up here where we have votes on it's on Thursday, Friday, Monday. So we made recommendations last Congress that we should do 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, or something similar. Essentially, reduce the number of travel days because in 2019 we actually traveled 66 days, and we were in Washington for 65 full days. So I mean, that's a big problem. So our recommendation in last Congress was to reduce the number of travel days. So, but we still have this challenge of, we got a weekend coming up where I got to be in DC on Friday and Monday. And for me to stay in Washington that weekend is going to cost, I don't know, $700, $800, $900, $1,000. And that's my personal money. So I have a disincentive to stay in Washington for the weekend and to actually, you know, ask one of my friends, Dean Phillips, hey, do you want to go out to dinner on Saturday? Because it's going to create a financial burden on me. And by the way, my wife has been to Washington 5 times in the last 2.5 years. So we've got to find a way to build these relationships where members are friends and they disagree, but they're friends. And the biggest challenge in my mind is forcing people to hate up close. Because again, I go to Twitter and Facebook. Like, you can't hate somebody you had dinner with last weekend. You can disagree with them, but you're not going to be ugly. So we've got to find a way to create human of relationships that transcend politics, and then let people disagree on policy, and then have conversations about the best direction for our country. So I'm a big proponent of forcing people to build bonds that will transcend the vitriol of politics. That was a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that was excellent. Thank you, Congressman Timmons. Congressman Kilmer, is there another point you'd like to get in here?
Maybe I'll share one or two more that I think are worth noting. It's funny, I recently talked, as we're talking about the kind of broken culture of Congress, interestingly enough, I talked to a former NCAA football coach who had taken over a dysfunctional team. And I asked him, do you have any key takeaways? And he said, you know what, it's all about the freshmen. He said, if you can help with culture on your incoming freshmen, that's how you can drive some organizational change. Now, so let's talk about what happens with freshmen up until the creation of our committee. When we went through freshman orientation, literally, we were told Democrats get on that bus, Republicans get on that bus. You had almost no interaction. It was tribal from the beginning. And so one of our recommendations was knock it off. Like have the process of orientation be bipartisan. In fact, we also had a recommendation that there should be a session on civility and on how we engage one another on the floor, and just how do you have a dynamic that's not the Jerry Springer show on the floor of Congress. So that's another one I would just kind of call out that I think is important. And then some of the stuff we looked at seems kind of small ball on its own, but matters. So another example, there was no, up until COVID, there was no space for Democrats and Republicans to talk to one another outside of the view of cameras. You're on the floor, and I'm a big transparency guy. I'm all for sunshine being a great disinfectant, but within the proximity of the House chamber, there was no place to just sit down and say like, hey, can we work something out? Interesting enough, that has changed with COVID. We actually made a recommendation to create some space for members to engage one another. And interestingly enough, because of COVID, that space is now the speaker's lobby, which used to be where the press hung out. And now it's where members in between votes can actually talk to each other. And there's something to that, to actually just being able to engage one another in a constructive way.
Yeah, I want to follow up too real quick. So
sure.
I want to just give a shout out to the speaker. We had originally we had a 1-year mission, and then that extended to 2, and we just got another 2 years. And there's been a lot of challenges that I think are the result of a centralization of power, and leadership wants the freshman orientation to be separate because they don't want to deal with a bunch of freshmen that are friends with each other. So we've gotten to the point where things are so dysfunctional that everyone, House Republican and Democrat leadership, that they both want to fix this problem. And so I think enough pressure has been created that there is a willingness to find a path forward where we can kind of walk hand in hand and tackle some of these big challenges. So I really just appreciate the fact that the Democrats and the Republicans are taking this seriously, and we're going to make some big changes, and I'm just excited to be a part of it.
So I think all of you can see why the Select Committee has this kind of aura around it, this reputation in DC for being this bright spot for bipartisanship and practical problem solving. There's just such a nice dynamic here that you're hearing from both of these good congressmen. It's just been delightful to watch. I'll just mention one other thing as someone who has testified before the committee. The committee's seating is Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, rather than across the aisle. And it's really interesting how much that changes the dynamic. What I'd like to change gears just a little bit here and go to this work of 1,200 Americans who took 90 minutes each to really take a deep dive and take a look at the 97 unanimous recommendations that the Select Committee made in the 116th Congress, and have weighed in and shared their thinking. So we want to share those results. So I'm going to share my screen at this stage and share with you a little bit about what that program is, how it works, and then the results. So this is one of our programs at the National Institute for Civil Discourse, and our aim here is to find and champion solutions wise enough to attract broad bipartisan support among everyday Americans. And we started this program in January of 2019, and now we're delighted that we have over 28,000 members. That is, we're attracting members at 3.5 times the speed and 13% the cost that we had projected. Now, Congressman, that may be the only thing I've ever done in my life that's gone faster and cheaper than expected. And I think it's probably a commentary on the hunger among the American people for a different kind of politics and the kind of politics and problem solving that the Select Committee is trying to foster. It's a very balanced group politically. We have 25% Republicans, 47% independents, and 24% Democrats. And we're in every state across the country. We have a nice national audience here tonight, and we're in every one of those states. We've got 936 members in Washington and 514 members in South Carolina. So I want to take you through now our work specifically on the Select Committee's good work. So we do our work to find and champion solutions wise enough to attract broad bipartisan support in 4 steps. And the first step is our members pick a couple of issues a year to work on. And one of those issues that our members picked was congressional reform, particularly the type that the Select Committee was working on. We knew the Select Committee was just being formed, and we thought that was interesting work. So that's the first step. The second step then is that we as staff then develop a pretty thorough brief on that topic. So in this case, a topic on congressional reform. So there you see the committee at work and seated Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. And so this is the brief that over 1,200 Americans have reviewed, spent 90 minutes reviewing. And it talks about the Select Committee and its charge, its mandate, and its final report and the 97 unanimous recommendations it made. And then we broke it into 2 sections, the 13 recommendations pertaining specifically to fostering bipartisanship and civility, and those committee reforms of the type that Chairman Kilmer was talking about, and some alternative ways of doing that, and a bunch of other kinds of reforms, the scheduling reform that Congressman Timmons was talking about. So our members really got a chance to dig in and see this with ready links to the report so they could go directly to the Select Committee's own work. We also then had a second section that was on all of the other recommendations that didn't directly relate to bipartisanship and civility, like making Congress more effective, efficient, and transparent, improving congressional capacity, et cetera. So that's the second step, is that our members, over 1,200 of them, spent 90 minutes reviewing that brief. That's the third step, is when they review that brief and weigh in. And so for every one of those recommendations, these members of our organization indicated whether they supported or opposed those recommendations. And then the fourth step is we announce the results, which we are about to do here tonight, and then engage Congress with those results, which we get to also begin that process here tonight with the 2 congressmen here. So Luke, we should have had a little drum roll here to set this up, as we, this is the world premiere of the results of 1,200 Americans, but I'll just start, with these headlines. Absolutely overwhelming support among the American people for the good work of the Select Committee and the particular recommendations that they made. So the vast majority of the recommendations received more than 3/4 support, and every single one of the 97 recommendations that we asked about received more than 65% support. So in a country that we're told is so deeply divided, we found there was a ready, obvious, overwhelming consensus for these 97 recommendations that were all unanimously made by the Select Committee. So I want to take you through some of the particulars of those results. As we talked about, the Select Committee focused particularly on fostering bipartisanship and civility. By our count, 13 different recommendations that pertain to that. We asked our members about those 3 recommendations sort of collectively and got a whopping 98% support for those. I ran, Congressman Moore talked about this, that I ran a pilot of this in the Idaho State Legislature for 5 years before we launched it federally. So I've done, this is about my 18th or 19th brief and set of results. I have never seen anything come close to 98% support. So I want you to know, Congressman, how unusual it is to get this kind of overwhelming support. We also asked them about each one of the 13 recommendations, and here I'll just highlight the 6 that got the highest recommendations. So our members, pretty noticeable, I would say, that when we asked Congressman Kilmer what his favorite was, he mentioned freshman orientation, and that gets a whopping 98% support. I think, like most freshmen in Congress, they're a little surprised to find out, you mean we don't do it in a nonpartisan way? Are you kidding me? And so just, you know, nobody can believe that you would want to do it any other way than in a bipartisan way. So just absolutely overwhelming support, again, burying the needle in a way we've never seen before. And then Congressman Timmons also mentioned the issues with the calendar and how much time you spend traveling and how hard it is to spend time together then. And one of the recommendations of the committee then is to change the calendar so that they have more time together. A typical week in Congress will start on Tuesday morning and run through Thursday afternoon, with members flying back and forth to their district on either end. So you have a lot of time spent traveling. And our members, again, 97% support for changing the calendar to create more working days and less travel time. And you can see some of the others here. And I think we're putting this in the chat room, Luke, the overall results, so you can drill into these and you can look at all 13 right there, and I'll let each of you do that. I will just drill into that calendar item that Congressman Timmons emphasized, and he mentioned, you know, you could do a 2-week on, 2-week off kind of a thing. So we drilled down into 3 different versions of a changed calendar, and the one that got overwhelming support, 97%, you know, support changing it in some fashion or another. And of the 3 kind of options that we looked at, one being 2 full work weeks with in Congress, 1 full district work week back in the district, and then a 3-1 or a 1-1. This really popped a little bit to a degree that surprised me, but our members really thought 2 weeks in Congress, 1 week back in the district, 89% supported that, and that was quite a bit more than the others. And in each of these, in the brief, you saw that there were pro and con arguments. So that, particularly on the calendar, we really dove into the arguments on that, had some analyses there. So our members really spent some time on that. And it's a fairly distinct finding there, a definitive finding of one version of a congressional calendar that would be superior. We also asked our members to answer open-ended questions, and they kind of weighed in here. And in just a minute, we're going to hear from a few of these folks, so I won't spend too much time on that. And then, of course, we had all of those other recommendations, and we broke those down by a number of the chapters, 7 of the 12 chapters in the final report. And you can see the results there. Again, overwhelming support across the board, but particularly the recommendations in Chapter 1 to make Congress more effective, efficient, and transparent got 99%. So that holds the record of the most consensus we have ever observed in using this kind of method, and also had some good open-ended responses from our members there on those recommendations and what they'd like to say to members of Congress. We also asked about whether the Select Committee is a committee of the House of Representatives. Of course, to really make Congress work better, you'd want both the Senate and the House making some of those changes. And some of those things like the calendar really work better if both the Senate and the House are doing it. So we ask our members first about, that idea of reestablishing the committee in the House in the 117th Congress to renew it. And that got 95% support. And then overwhelming support again for both the Senate creating its own select committee and also for a joint committee of the House and Senate to look at modernization of the Congress. So that is the kind of work that 1,200 Americans did to take a look at what the Select Committee did. And we want to just give a chance here for a couple of members of CommonSense American who took that time to do that, to comment just a little bit, to share their thoughts. And they've each got a question that they'd like to pose as we start to transition to the question and answer period. And so we'll first go to Michael Bartell. Michael, have we got you here? And you want to go ahead? And
yes, sir. Hope everyone can hear me.
Yes.
It's really interesting that both the chair and the vice chair touched on the freshman orientation aspect of the Select Committee's work. I think the recommendation that freshman orientation be nonpartisan is really important. So can our guests tell us if there's anything that's happening to implement these recommendations? The recommendation is great, but what direction are we going in?
As the person that has been through freshman orientation more recently, I guess I'll start. So I literally remember where I was standing when this very, very kind woman was like, Republican or Democrat? And I thought she was joking. I literally thought it was a joke. And she was like, no. If you're a Republican, you have to go on that bus. And I was like, that is just wrong. Like, I just remember in my core, I was like, this is terrible. So we made a number of recommendations. The biggest recommendation that I think that is helpful during orientation was you are by yourself. When I got elected, my chief of staff is someone I've known my whole life, and he was able to not work, but the vast majority of members are by themselves and they're just running around like a chicken with his head cut off. And they always use the phrase drinking water from a fire hose. And when you're by yourself, it's just really hard. So one of the recommendations we made was to allow freshmen, new members to bring on a staffer for, it's literally like 30 days. So having someone there to help you kind of manage everything, generally it's going to be your future chief of staff. If you don't have one, it's just somebody. So that was adopted. There were a number of other joint briefings that were given that previously were done on a partisan basis. We still have work to do, but I do think that House admin took our recommendation seriously and that we're moving in the right direction. So I was pleased with the first orientation after our recommendations. And I do think that next orientation is going to be even better because obviously COVID just is COVID. I mean, life's been very strange for the last year. So I think next Congress, their orientation will be even better and we can continue to build, like the chairman said, the freshmen will create the ethos of the body for years to come.
Excellent. Thank you. And I just want to check, we had one member that was ready to comment and ask a question, and then she had something come up and she wasn't sure if she was going to be able to make it. Nikki Najet, were you able to join us if we got you here? No. Okay, let's go to Steve Huff. Steve, do we have you here?
Yes, I just had to unmute.
There we go. Steve, go ahead and offer your comments on the experience with CommonSense American of going through the Select Committee's work and your views on the Select Committee generally, and then go ahead and ask your question.
Sure, I appreciate you holding this event and for the work that CommonSense American does. This has been my first participation in weighing in on the briefs, and also thank you to the congressman for your work on the select committee. The recommendations, I believe, are very important and all worthy of consideration. Want to give a shout out to the independents in CommonSense America. Your first graphic showed we're at 47%, and Gallup and Pew and all the pollsters, say that's a trend that's, likely not to slow down, even though the pundits like to say that we're actually just leaners. So shout out to independents. I am one myself, and after retiring 9.5 years ago, I had been up to that point just a casual observer of politics and passively involved, meaning basically just voting in general elections. So I decided to get more involved and started out on my local newspaper's comment site. And I was shocked by the amount of vitriol and the rancorous comments that people were making on, just a local small community newspaper. And it got so bad that they actually had to, shut down the comments. And at that time, the approval, Gallup, as you know, polls on this monthly, and the approval of Congress at that time was 13%. And so I decided to reach out to some more independent organizations, got involved, became more active, which eventually led me to this endeavor. But the question that I'd like to ask the congressman has to do with, in my process over the last 9.5 years of educating myself on, different nonpartisan reforms that are being advocated, such as, open primaries, and how do we, make our representatives be able to be more cooperative. Read, a couple of books. I've been on, especially over the last year, many of these type of events. And there's a number of former congressmen out there that are saying that when they served, they actually had communications with members of the opposite party about working together on a particular issue. And they would get the response that, well, hey, I think that's important. I'd love to work with you on that because I think that needs to be addressed. But if I do, I'm either going to be, number one, punished in some form by my party's leadership, or I'm going to be primaried in the next election. So I wanted to ask the congressman here to this evening whether they've experienced that, either one of those situations personally, or they know of other acquaintances, members of Congress, who have maybe related similar situations to them.
So I'm happy to take first swing, William. I will tell you my first, since we just had a conversation about freshman orientation, my first week in Congress, my first year, I served on the Armed Services Committee, and they had all of the freshman members of Armed Services and Foreign Affairs go to the Pentagon and meet with the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs. And when that meeting was over, they drove back to the Capitol, and the bus pulled into the Capitol around 7 p.m. And it was my first week on the job. So I was like, this is my opportunity to get to know some of my colleagues. So I stood up on the bus and said, hey, I'm going to grab a burger. If anyone wants to come up, there's Good Stuff Burgers up on Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm going to go grab a burger if anyone wants to come. And we had 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans go up to this burger joint on Pennsylvania Avenue. And we just talking, breaking bread, right? And how did you get to Congress? What was your race like? What's the, what brought you here? How's your family doing through all this? And, at some point, like 45 minutes in or so, I said something along the lines of, seems like we ought to be able to get some of this stuff figured out, right? And the guy sitting across the table from me was a Republican from the Midwest. It just so happened he was a Republican. I could unfortunately probably tell this story with a Democrat from California, but it wasn't. It was a Republican from the Midwest. He said, Derek, I like you. He said, in fact, his parents used to live in my district. He said, after freshman orientation, I called my parents and said, you know what, you seem to be represented by what seems to be a pretty good guy. And I said, well, thank you. And he said, now here's what you don't understand. He said, I won my seat by defeating a Republican incumbent. And he said, and I ran against him as not being conservative enough. He said, the first vote I cast when I got to Congress was a vote against John Boehner for Speaker of the House. And he said, and I sent out a press release after that vote and said I voted against John Boehner because he was too compromising, too willing to work with Democrats. And he said, I was applauded in my district for that vote. He said, Derek, here's the thing. I like you, but what you don't understand is my constituents didn't send me here to work with you. They sent me here to stop you. And I walked out of that burger joint and I called up my wife and I said, I have two reactions to this. One, how incredibly honest and forthcoming. And second, oh my God, right? Like that is a big problem, right? If just working with folks across the aisle is somehow the scarlet letter, we're really hosed. And so for what it's worth, interestingly enough, I ended up working with that guy on a couple of bills because I made it like my mission to find something to work with him on. But that is indeed a challenge. And you know, what's tricky for our committee is there are things that are certainly within our purview, and we've kind of stretched that mandate as much as we can. There are things from how states do their primaries to how district boundaries get drawn to campaign finance issues that we have not as a committee sort of taken as our own. There are committees that are already tasked with those assignments. You know, we've thought about it and we've even talked as a committee, do we want to start pulling on those threads? Now our committee, to make a recommendation, we're required to get 9 of 12 votes on our committee. And being able to land the plane on some of those topics is a little trickier, but I can tell you, and I see the title of next to your name, you know, I'm in a state that is a top 2 primary state where the top 2 voters, vote getters, regardless of party, move on to the general election. And as a consequence, you know, in Eastern Washington, we have Dan Newhouse, who was a member of our committee serving, you know, and Dan was a state legislator like me. We were good friends in the legislature. He then was the ag secretary for our Democratic governor. He's a Republican. In his district, that district is pretty solidly Republican, and it was a Republican versus Republican general election, and it was Dan Newhouse, who had worked for a Democratic governor, running against basically the Rush Limbaugh of Washington State, a talk radio host, and Dan won. I told Dan at the time, if you need me to come to your district and say good things about you, I'm willing to. And if you want me to come to your district and say you're just too damn conservative, I'm willing to do that too, whatever helps. But, you know, so there are some of these systemic issues that are outside of our committee's purview, but I think also are really vital if we're going to think about how to fix this place. Sorry if I answered too long there, Keith.
No, that was a very fantastic answer. And let me just echo what the chairman just said. Steve, yes, yes, yes. The answer to your question is yes. These are some of the biggest challenges facing Congress. I'd never understood the difference between all the different states and the manner in which they send people to Congress. South Carolina, we have a primary, and it's an open primary, and then we have a runoff. You have to get 50% in order to advance to the general, and then you have a general election. Only one of our districts is legitimately contested, and it's not even really that contested outside of strange cycles. So, you know, the different manners in which all these different states send people to Congress creates the challenges. And so in my race, I was one of 13. I was the highest currently serving elected official at the time I was in the state Senate. And the person that was my number one, I don't use the word opponent, the other person that was most likely to win was so much more conservative than me in the manner in which they presented themselves. We would always vote the same, but he was just loud. So, you know, my campaign slogan was conservative, not crazy. And, you know, it's a great slogan. I love it. But the other side of that is I have to be very careful to maintain the support of the very conservative movement I believe in, a very limited role of government, and there's not a lot of space between me and the far right, other than the manner in which we conduct ourselves. I'm not mean. I'm nice, and I want to work with people on things we agree on. So it is just a constant issue that everyone has to work with. But at the end of the day, really only 60-ish seats are continually contested. So those 60 seats are the ones that receive the lion's share of the attention. And yeah, I mean, again, the answer to your question is yes. It's a constant issue, and it is one of the biggest problems we have.
So one of the things I've really appreciated about both Chair Kilmer and Vice Chair Timmons is, their combination of really trying to foster bipartisanship and civility, but they're very frank and honest. It doesn't mean that you're just singing kumbaya, and I think that so thank you, Steve, for the frank question, and thank you, Congressman, for the frank answers to that and the real challenges that you face today. So we have just a long list of really great questions here. You've really energized our group here, Congressman. Before we go to those some more questions, let me just invite you both to comment a little. We've got, we've had well over 200 people on the call with us tonight. Many of them have spent that 90 minutes reviewing the brief on your work and weighing in. I want to give you a chance to respond to the results themselves and to this kind of approach that we take at CommonSense American to try to engage Congress in a little more productive way. Maybe we'll go to you first, Congressman Kilmer.
One, I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the engagement. And two, it is a model that our committee is likely to dig into. We have a work plan for the year, and in September, we're going to have 2 hearings related to how do we restore civic engagement. And I think one of the things that excites me about this effort is that, figuring out how we connect citizens and their lawmakers, I think, is part of how we fix a system where for far too many Americans, they don't feel a sense of efficacy and they don't feel like anyone's listening. And I think there's real value in this model. So I really appreciate your engagement.
Thank you. Congressman Timmons.
I've always tried to help my constituents and other people's constituents understand how best to interact with elected officials. We have extremely limited time. We represent 800,000 people. So it's very challenging to put the time and the effort in. And this job is exhausting. I mean, I joke, I'm ambassador elite status at Bonvoy. And when I got that, they said, we've never seen somebody with this status. You realize that you spend the night in a hotel 1 in 3 nights. And I looked at him, I was like, that's terrible. I don't want to spend the night in a hotel room 1 in 3 nights. So, just this job's difficult. And you all know how people can be on social media, and it's really brutal. My mother sees the comments people make on posts. My wife sees it, and my family gets very upset, and it's tough to kind of just brush it off. And you want to respond. You want to say, I'm sorry, can we meet? Can you talk to me about this? I can't fathom that you would say that if we were sitting down having a cup of coffee. And that didn't happen back when the internet didn't exist. And technology has made it so much more efficient, but it's also given people, they talk about the drawer rule. Back in the day, you would write a letter to your congressman, you'd put it in the drawer, and you'd send it out the next day. And the next morning you'd wake up and be like, I don't want to send that. What was I thinking? But when you're on Twitter or on Facebook, it's just, and you send it. And it's just nasty. So I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to engage in a productive manner and talk about policy, because that's how we're going to solve these problems. We're not going to solve them by yelling at each other on Twitter. I know I keep going there, but I get yelled at a lot on Twitter, so I don't know. Maybe I'm just sensitive. But anyways.
It's usually just me yelling at Timmons on Twitter
by the way.
There we go.
Welcome back, Congressman Moore. Yeah, I hope your son hits a home run.
So we've got just a bunch of great questions. Congressman Timmons, I think you're okay if we went just a few minutes over. Is that all right? And Congressman Kilmer, would that be all right if we went just a few minutes long?
I can go a few minutes long. Yeah.
Okay, we'll keep it brief. We've got a couple of kind of similar questions, and maybe we'll go to Sarah Silver to ask hers, and then I might, Sarah, just expand on it. There's a bit of a theme of others asking similar questions. Sarah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. I wanted to ask you both the question as to what your relationship is with the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House. Because it seems to me that there's a fairly strong intersection. So either of you or both of you, thank you.
Good, and if I can just expand on that, a couple of other questions we saw, we've got the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House. We've got the bipartisan working group that both Congressman Kilmer and Congressman Moore are on. Over on the Senate side, there's the CommonSense Coalition, sometimes called the G20. In a 50-50 Senate and a very closely split Congress, these are turning out to be really important groups. So maybe you could speak to each of these, problem solvers, bipartisan working group, the CommonSense Coalition, and kind of how they work together, and your sense of kind of the influence they're able to have at this point in this Congress.
I'll just say briefly, one, the problem solvers get a fair amount of credit for their role in the creation of this committee. I mentioned that there was work underway looking at rules changes. The problem solvers were very engaged in. They weren't the only ones that were, but they were certainly among the most engaged on it. And among the proposed rules changes was to create a committee like this. And so that's probably the primary point I'd make, is that they were involved kind of at the origin story. I am very supportive of any entity within the Congress that's trying to foster collaboration and civility. And so I was a member of, I think, everything that Keith just mentioned, the problem solvers and the bipartisan working group. And, I chair this committee, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the bipartisan working group. And at some point, my grandma's a Dutch immigrant, and I remembered one of her Dutch sayings, which is, with one backside, you can only sit on so many of the horses of the carousel. So I ended up leaving the problem solvers caucus to focus on the others, because I was sitting on too many horses. But I'm very supportive of the work that they do. The work of our committee is, certainly as it pertains to civility and collaboration, there's a great amount of overlap. Our mandate is beyond that, though. We're working on issues related to, staffing of the Congress and trying to recruit, retain, and have diverse staff. We're digging into nitty-gritty technology issues and issues related to franking and communications, which I think the Problem Solvers Caucus is grateful they don't have to deal with. So hopefully that answers your question.
Good.
I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So some of my closest friends are in the Problem Solvers Caucus. I considered applying to join it this past Congress. Right now, I'm stretched very thin on financial services. I'm on 3 subcommittees, and I'm the vice chair of the Modernization Committee. In addition to, I was getting a master's in cybersecurity. I graduated 2 weeks ago, and I'm in the National Guard. So it's just overwhelming. So honestly, after this Congress, it's definitely something I'll consider doing, because I do anticipate that I'll have fewer obligations next Congress. They do great work, and I definitely support the collaborative spirit that they have. But their biggest challenge is to try to get us to work on these big problems before we have to do something, because when you run up on the deadline, it's just 4 people making decisions and bringing their whole team along. And I've been in Congress for 30 months, and most of the decisions we've made as a Congress involve last minute decision making with horse trading, and it is not the best way to do it. And I think that we are the best chance. This committee is the best chance to create more regular order, more committee work that actually translates into law. And so again, that's why I'm going to be focusing on this committee the bulk of my time over the next 18 months.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Well, in the interest of time, we have just a ton of great questions, but we want to honor, we've heard this theme of how tough congressmen's schedules are. So we want to not be part of the problem ourselves and give them a little bit of an evening yet. So let's have this be the last question. Catherine, I don't have your last name, Catherine, but a question about the view outside of the committee of their work. Catherine, you want to go ahead? Catherine, have we got you?
Keith, if Catherine isn't here, I can go ahead and read her question as she had sent it to me.
Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, Catherine's question was, is there any support, and to what degree is there support for the work of the Select Committee in Congress among congressmen outside of the Select Committee? So how do your colleagues in Congress look at the work that you're doing if they're not directly involved on it?
You want me to jump in and then I'll let the chairman close out? All right. So it's funny. People don't understand your life in Congress is so committee centric. There's 31 committees, and all of I think that's right. Don't quote me on that, but it's close. And most of your time is spent in your committee's jurisdiction. So the biggest challenge is trying to get people to appreciate what's going on. And we just hired a new comms director, and she's fantastic, and we can't wait for her to really get going. And I was talking to her before we hired her, and I said, this is unusual because you have a dual role. Your role is to, number one, do communications for the outside world, for the American people, for the media, but probably equally important, if not more important, is doing communications for within Congress, because we have such an incredible opportunity to make big changes to this institution that will affect the American people for years and years to come. But we can't do it without the support of our colleagues. And so we not only are communicating to the outside world, but we're more importantly communicating to our members, because that's the way we're going to actually get these recommendations put into effect. So I hate to say it, but I bet 30% of the members of Congress don't know that we even exist. I mean, there's just some people that they're not as in tune with what's going on in Congress as they could be. And I might be generous in saying 30%, but we're going to fix that over the next 18 months. And, so many of our recommendations are going to come down to the next speaker election. And the next speaker, and I'm assuming that Speaker Pelosi is not running again. Maybe she is. I don't know. Maybe she wins. I don't know. I don't care who the next speaker. Well, I do care who the next speaker is in my Republican hat, but as my modernization hat, I don't care who the next speaker is, because I just want them to implement these recommendations because it will help everyone. So part of our job is to make sure that the rest of Congress knows the importance of the recommendations that this bipartisan committee that is spending 2 years of our time, 4 years of our time on, and really get as much implemented as possible. Mr. Chairman, what do you think?
So I'll give you the good news. That was maybe the more glass half empty. I'll give you the glass half full. The good news is, as we wound down at the end of last year and hit what was going to be our expiration date as a committee, you had a majority of the last freshman class, now the sophomore class, send a letter to House leadership saying, this work is really important. It should keep going. I was very heartened by that. Similarly, you've seen outreach and engagement by corners that are again, very heartening to me. the vice chair of our committee in the last Congress was Tom Graves. You know, he and I went and presented to the Republican Study Committee. As far as I can tell, I was the first Democrat ever allowed in the room of the Republican Study Committee. But they were very engaged, very welcoming, and very committed to wanting to see us make Congress work better for the American people. Similarly, Tom and I went and visited the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and I'm pretty sure Tom may have been the first Republican to visit that group. And so I think there is engagement by our colleagues, and for those who are following it, a desire to see things improve. We're going to keep working, and I encourage all of you who are interested in the work we're doing, you know, certainly follow our work on social media, but also make sure that you're communicating with your elected officials about the importance of this work, and make sure they're invested and involved and engaged too. And again, thanks for having us tonight. We really appreciate your engagement on our committee's work.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman Kilmer, and thank you, Congressman Timmons. You know, we had a number of chat comments making exactly the point you just made, Congressman Kilmer, that you know, people should call their congressman and express their support for the Select Committee's work. That's where we go with CommonSense American at this point. Having announced it, we will now start engaging members of Congress with these results. We did 150 congressional briefings on our results on surprise medical billing, which helped actually get that passed. And so we're certainly going to try to help spread the word. And the members of CommonSense American are committed to doing that. But everybody on this call can help out by contacting their members of Congress. So we'll wrap it up here. And Chairman Kilmer and Vice Chairman Timmons, just many thanks for joining us this evening. And thank you for really the excellent bipartisan practical leadership that you and your fellow Select Committee members are providing the nation. We just think your work's critically important and that you're doing it remarkably well. And it's just been a genuine pleasure to have you tonight. So we've got in the chat, you can track the committee's work on their website. modernizedcongress.house.gov is in the chat, and their Twitter handle is there. So make sure that you're following their good work and supporting it. Want to also thank Braver Angels. NICD is grateful to them for founding the America's Public Forum series and for their invitation to NICD to be a co-host with them in that series. So you can expect more events like this one in the series on Wednesday evenings throughout the year. And thanks to Luke and his colleagues, Dennis and Elizabeth, for making this all work beautifully this evening. Braver Angels is really one of the most impressive organizations in the country working to build civility and empathy across our divides. And they host a variety of workshops, debates, forums, and other events. And if you'd like to attend or get involved, you can find more by subscribing to Braver Angels newsletter on their website, braverangels.org, which is also in the chat, and as well as their social media handles. And of course, NICD, the National Institute for Civil Discourse, also works to build the nation's capacity to engage our differences more constructively. And you can find opportunities to join us in our work along those lines at our website, nicd.arizona.edu. And you can join our CommonSense American program specifically that we highlighted tonight by going directly to commonsenseamerican.org. All of those links are also in the chat and our social media handles. And then finally, thanks to all of you for joining us on this important conversation tonight. Braver Angels and NICD believe that the American people will be our saving grace. Thank you for being part of the solution, and thanks for joining us. Have a good evening, everybody.